Welcome everybody to our next How conversation. I am just delighted to welcome Paul Polman, my friend, a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler, and an embodiment of moral leadership. And not just a personal embodiment of moral leadership, but Paul Polman is somebody who I've long admired for scaling moral leadership in his institution at the time, Unilever, and then beyond in capitalism itself and in the broader business community.
Thank you, Dov. Looking forward to it. Thanks for the opportunity.
You created Unilever's Sustainable Living Plan, probably 10 to 20 years before it became fashionable, if not so practical, to be principled. You are now the co-founder and chair of Imagine, and you're going to tell us about that. You are a board member of the How Institute for Society, and in that regard, we are in common cause. You are a member of the World Economic Forum's International Business Council. You chair the B team. You're the vice chair of the United Nations Global Compact. Welcome, Paul. I'm just thrilled to have you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you, Doug. Certainly looking forward to it as well.
Well, one of the great ironies or paradoxes of the world, the way it is right now, that one of the ways you know somebody is being guided by their moral compass is they're doing something inconvenient. They're doing something unpopular. They're doing something even dangerous or short-term unprofitable. How do you advise somebody that wants to do the right thing, but it's inconvenient? What you did at Unilever was not convenient. You ran into obstacles, and we'll talk about some of those. It takes courage and bravery. What an irony. We tell employees to be courageous and speak up in a meeting. Why don't we create cultures where it doesn't take courage to speak up, if you will? So we find ourselves in a time where it's not enough to have a moral compass. You need courage because the world has the boundaries that it has, and it takes courage and bravery to pursue this type of path. How do you unlock that?
And courage, good to remind everybody, comes from the French word cœur, which actually means heart. So your comment on the heart and the mind together is important. So we have to cultivate that courage. And what we find is sometimes it is in individuals based on their crucibles in life, their life journeys, their learnings, and they muster a certain level that gives you the Mandelas or the Gandhis or the Martin Luther Kings, and many of the exceptional people that we now have in all walks of life, as has been shown during the Ebola crisis. And sometimes we need to help people do that collectively. We find, for example, with CEOs, when we bring them now together with the new partnership I've created with Imagine, that they collectively become more courageous and move more areas to what I would call pre-competitive, or often what falls under the heading future of humanity, where you actually see them becoming bold and brave. But it requires different platforms sometimes to get to that. So I think we have the elements there to unlock that courage inside of us, to make that little diamond shine, and to attack these issues. CEOs will not be remembered for the profits they made in their companies or how fast the company grew. CEOs will ultimately be remembered for the impact they had on society. Did they touch many people? Did they leave it in a better place? Were they a positive contributor to invest in these societal issues? Become a net positive person, for us, is easy to understand. We get more friends, we have a richer life, it has a deeper meaning. And often we express that in our family and friend circles very well. But then as it goes to work, it looks like we throw these values out of a window and start behaving totally differently, as if we're wearing a mask, as if we are actors. If we could combine that and live a full life and be our whole selves, then there is no reason why we cannot get to this point. It's not utopianism or idealism. It's very much within our reach. And companies that do that unlock an enormous potential for people to drive to their fullest. And these companies are high performing, and they are the ones that are going to survive. They are the ones that society wants to keep around. Also, by the way, great fun to work in them.
Right. In the spirit of some recap, if you put your teacher hat on that you're going to impart, what is the Paul, when we talk about moral leadership, I know that first and foremost, a moral leader is animated by a purpose that's connected to human progress and a better world and is viewed by others to be in the grip of such a purpose. That's always been at the center of what you've been up to and have advocated. But round out your framework of moral leadership. You've talked about humility, thinking not less of yourself, but of yourself less. You've talked about the need to not just have a moral compass, but the courage to be guided by it. Round out your model of moral leadership so that we can encapsulate it for our listeners and viewers.
Well, first and foremost, Dov, I believe a good leader is a good human being. You just need to go back to the basic qualities, and you find leaders in all parts of society. In fact, I find them more in areas where we are not looking than the people that we celebrate. The fact that we are CEOs or get a CEO title doesn't make us a good leader. In fact, we're terribly short of good leaders amongst people that are in power. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in. And then you see how we deal with Ebola or with COVID now on the ground, how people come to the rescue when there is a natural disaster and even put themselves at risk to help others. These are the real leaders. People that understand that putting the interest ahead of others, putting the interest of others ahead of their own, and by doing so, they're better off themselves as well, are for me the true leaders. So I don't know where that comes from. I've been fortunate enough to be born in the Netherlands. I was born in 1956. I thought it was a long time after the war, but the older I get, the more I realize how close it was. My father was 15 when the war started, and he was 20 when the war ended. It took away his high school. It took away his education. He had to have 2 jobs. He literally worked himself to death. He passed on, unfortunately, when he was 68. But he had a goal. His goal was that there was peace in Europe, that nobody had to suffer the way they were suffering. His goal was to ensure that we would get education that was deprived from him, all his 6 children, that the communities in which he was living with my mother, obviously, that they would thrive and rebuild. They put themselves totally to the service of others. Now, I grew up in that environment. We had a toilet at home. I didn't have open defecation. We had a piece of bar soap, so I got past the age of 4. Thank God my parents got food, so I wasn't stunted or died of hunger. And I was born in the Netherlands, where the government gives me free education. I wouldn't be talking to you right now if I wasn't born in the Netherlands. Now, what did I do for it? Nothing. But it gave me the independence, the financial independence to do what I want, to find the jobs that I like. And the longer I'm at this, the more I realize that we're in a small minority of about 5% of the world population that has won what I call the lottery ticket of life. And if you have won the lottery ticket of life, I believe that it is your duty, your obligation to put yourself to the service of others. And by doing so, once more, you're better off yourself as well. The Dalai Lama said it very well when he said, if you seek enlightenment just for yourself to enhance your own causes, you miss purpose. But if you seek enlightenment to help others achieve their objectives, you are with purpose. And it's much better, I find, to live a life with purpose.
There's also just palpable humility in hearing you describe your coming of age. You're so in touch with the luck and good fortune, having just been born. You've gone so far and had such a remarkable career as a leader, as a businessman, but you seem to feel lucky, and it could have gone differently. And it was Elie Wiesel who taught that our attitude towards gratitude says more about our character than anything else. And in many ways, it's your gratitude, I think, if I could speak for you, Paul, that is animating so much of why you're able to put the concerns of others first. Is that a fair summation of what you're in touch with?
Yeah, plus the realization that for one reason or another, which to my opinion is serendipity more than anything else, you are put in a position to do something about it. That's why I don't believe in retirement either. That's why I focus entirely on implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, which I had the fortune of helping develop. I do believe that we can, in the next 15, 20 years, irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. I have grandchildren. Soon I have great-grandchildren. I hope to see some of them still. I want them to benefit from this wealth as much as I do. What rights do we have in the last 40 years alone, basically this generation, to do more damage to the planet Earth than all the generations before in the billions of years we've been in existence? What right do we have to put, as we talk right now, a million species out of existence and risk their extinction? What rights do we have to deplete the world's scarce resources? I don't get it. I honestly don't get it. It has nothing to do with the system of business that we have designed. I don't want to be part of that. I want to be sure that we create something that works for all and that is within our means. And it's actually economically more viable now.
So in many ways, if we're really going to change the system, it seems like we need to ensure that those with power, those who have the gears of the system, the levers of the system in their hands, those with formal authority, those in charge, are these kinds of leaders with the courage and the moral compass. How do we go about not just ensuring that society has these leaders, but putting the levers of the system in their hands?
Well, there are different ways of doing that. And one of the things that you see in COVID, for example, that countries that are run by women, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Denmark, New Zealand, and a few others, have dealt with this crisis better. They dealt with the truth, they accepted the science, they put the experts in place, they took care of their people, they had consistent, open and fair communication. There was a high level of trust, and it also affected positively the behavior change. So comment number one is, be sure that we have a more gender diverse representation at the top. I do believe that makes a difference. Countries where more women are in parliament or in their political system also tend to do better. So it scales up. So we need to get diversity. The second thing is that we need to bring more of the things down to where the actual work happens. We need to treasure communities. Whilst countries might be failing, you take the US on climate change, if I may be direct, your previous government has outright failed to take responsible action on climate change that now has to be corrected. But we've lost time, people haven't necessarily suffered. But despite that, most of the actions were still happening on the ground. In fact, 60% of the US GDP had made climate commitments at state level, at city level, at even local regional levels. So we need to treasure these communities on the ground. And the third area is, to be honest, is to give a bigger seat at the table to the next generation. Half of the world population is below 30 years old. They're going to be 100% tomorrow. They are more purpose-driven. They are more creative with technology. They have a different thinking in terms of multi-generational. They work in partnerships in very creative ways. And many of the solutions actually come from that part of the population. So I would argue, in this case, don't only give them a seat at the table, perhaps it's time that we give them the table. So if you work on those levels, I think it would go a far way in addressing some of the issues that you mentioned, Dov.
Mm-hmm. And just to put, if this is the solution, let's be real about the current state of affairs. At a recent Howe Institute gathering, you said or reminded everybody that 40% of companies have had 3 or more CEOs in the last 10 years. And you said that means something is fundamentally wrong. You said more than half don't truly have succession planning. And then you said only 17% of employees think that their leader has this moral compass that you think is so essential, that you believe in, and I share with you, is so essential. Where's your hope and optimism given that reality?
When I made those comments, I also made the comment on top of that boards need to change. Yeah. We don't have boards that are climate competent. We don't have boards that understand the whole area of sustainability. We have boards that came from the past, and often shareholder primacy still dictates many of the board meetings. And again, I would quote from statistics. It's not just my own opinion. So we do need to have a whole different cadre of leaders. And that's why I took the chairmanship of the Side Business School at Oxford. I'm on the board of some other universities, right. The Vanguard, the Howe Institute, what you are doing, One Young World. I do believe that a lot of the investment we have to make is in this, investing in these new leaders that we actually already need today, but nurturing them and cultivating them and providing space for them. The reason I have hope, and I would say hope is a better word than optimism. Desmond Tutu said it well when he said in one of the panels I was on with him, I'm a prisoner of hope. I have hope because of technology. You know, 5 years ago in 2014 or 6 years ago, the International Energy Agency said that renewable energy, wind and solar, would be 5 cents per kilowatt hour in 2050. We've achieved that in 2020, in 6 years, what otherwise would have taken 36 years. So technology gives us hope. I also think that the hope comes from the fact, sadly enough, that the cost of not acting is now in most areas higher than the cost of acting, which is also for people that don't believe in the moral compass, but want the laws of economics to drive, is a good thing. And I have a lot of hope in the young generation that we talked about.
The first time you and I ever met, it was in a gathering of CEOs. And I was somewhat Socratic, and I asked the room the following question. And it was an off-the-record discussion, so people had incentive to be even more candid. I said, can you work with your head of HR and identify your top 25 performers in your respective companies? Remember, Paul, every hand went up because we had sophisticated performance management systems. The second question was, with the same confidence and alacrity, can you name your top 25 ethical leaders, your moral leaders, the ones who really shape the culture and put the moral compass where it belongs? And Paul, you remember we looked around the room and most hands went down. And then I said, is there anything about the way the world, this was 12 years ago, anything about the way the world is changing and being reshaped that suggests that we have an imperative to get an answer to the second question that's as clear as the first? And hands went up. And then the next question is, and should they be the same? Should your top performers be your top ethical leaders? And hands went up. And what I loved about your answer that day is you liked that you were on the path and that you had an answer to the second question, but you were candid at the time saying it's not as sharp and defined and concrete as the first, and it was part of your journey. So putting you on the spot, looking back at Unilever today and other organizations that you know, can they and are they able to identify their top purpose-inspired, values-based leaders with the same confidence that they can bring the traditional KPIs to traditional performance?
I would say that in some cases you might be able to differentiate more now than we were able to do 5 or 10 years ago, or when you posed that question, Dov. I think we're getting better at identifying that, but we are not as good yet as codifying that, because ultimately it has to get into the company's values and behaviors. But you know, if you now look at the CEOs themselves and you ask management, actually only 7% of the CEOs of the people feel that their CEOs are moral leaders all the time. And people that work for you look at you. It's the shadow of the leader, it's your behavior. So the question is not, how can we identify these other leaders that we might call moral leaders if we are not able to be ourselves the moral leaders we need to be? Because otherwise we're looking for people in the self-mirroring of our own. And if we do that, we actually perpetuate the problem versus finding the solutions.
So, and at the same time, even if you embody moral leadership, if we don't translate that into observable frameworks and codifications of behavior, it gets hard to scale. It's hard to scale leadership if all we ask people to do is to emulate what's being embodied by the moral leader on top. The moral leader has to become an architect to put in place a system that's articulated and measured so that others can go to the moral gym and build that muscle, if you will.
Yeah, one of the big debates I had in Unilever all the time, which would bug me somehow, but I never solved that, to be honest. And the same when I was at P&G. At P&G, I got a bonus once because I'd done such great work for diversity. And so at that time, A.G. Lovely, here is extra money. I said, sorry, I'm going to refuse that. Everybody around me told me it was crazy. I said, no, it is not. Because if you don't believe in that, you shouldn't work here. We should take money away from the ones that don't do it, but we shouldn't incentivize everything with money. When I went to Unilever, which by the way was immediately a gender diverse board, and we have 50% gender diverse management, and actually through the value chain, we made that well beyond our company. But people said, you need to be rewarded on CSR, on ESG, and you need to get an ESG measure. And some of the financial community was telling me, how much do you get compensated on ESG? So we know you're serious. I said, nothing, and I will never accept that. But I will work very hard to ensure that people that don't buy into this are not part of this company, because they're the cancer of the fabric that makes us great or makes us fail. And the interesting thing is, when you do that, it might take you 1 or 2 years longer to get there, or perhaps 5 years longer, but it's ingrained in the value of the company.
You just said something so profound, Paul. You know, when I think of CEOs today and those in charge, and you ask them, you know, what behaviors do you want to see more from in those who work throughout your organization? They say some of the things that you've been talking about, right? Having a compass, putting others first, everything you've been talking about. And you and I both know that if we tripled everybody's salaries, we would not get more of those things. Right. Just like you said, you turned down that bonus because you don't want the wrong incentive. You did that because it's right. So we find ourselves at an incredible juncture that the things we want, even if we tripled people's salaries, we wouldn't get more of. So we have to reflect more deeply. If money's not going to get us the qualities and behaviors that we want in others, if you tripled somebody's salary, it's not going to make them more courageous. It's not going to make them more humble. It might make them more arrogant, right? Oh, I got paid more. So we have to go back to the drawing board. If the best lever, carrots, money, doesn't get us what we want, we have to scale that which does generate these more elevated human behaviors. And it is a sense of purpose that's worthy of my loyalty and dedication. It is leaders who are creating such an equal and fair and trust-filled environment that I will stay committed to being tethered on a path to them. So I think you said something really profound by turning down the money, is that money shouldn't try to incentivize that which it can't.
Yeah, and what we have found over and over with Unilever, the stronger our purpose became, our reason for being became, not only were we attracting 2 million people every year, the third most looked up company on LinkedIn, which surprised us after Google and Apple. We are not even a brand name in that sense. We became preferred employers in every country, and our engagement score went to the top of the top tercile. And all these people were frankly not, we pay competitively with the market, but we don't play the game of the top tercile because we want the best. We actually were in a very moderate pay scale level, and everybody could have gone somewhere else. My biggest problem was we didn't have at times enough turnover to renew where I needed to renew. People were absolutely driven by that mission that unlocked that enormous amount of energy that drove the performance of the company, not the money.
And in your journey, Paul, I should say this was really tested because you were on this path, and towards the end of your tenure, 3G and Warren Buffett and Kraft came calling. And I think they came calling within the rubric of what we would call shareholder primacy. They did a bunch of calculations that if Unilever and Kraft combine, the financial reality will go from here to there, and shareholders, and normally boards meet and they look through that lens, and if it doesn't look attractive, they put out a statement, something to the effect, we've carefully considered the offer in good faith, but we've determined that it doesn't sufficiently reflect our values. Instead, in your case, what was put out there is, we've considered it and we thought deeply about it, and we don't believe that we share similar models of capitalism, that we share values. And then you said, and we don't think our cultures will work well together. At any price, we don't belong in a marriage. You rejected a proposed merger on moral grounds, on your conception of capitalism. But you weren't. But the only reason you were able to do that is the 9 years that preceded that. People didn't say, "Oh, this is just poker. This is just a fancy bluff." When you said it, everything, in my view, that you did until that date made this sound sincere because it was sincere. It's the natural thing to do if this is the path you're on. And you passed that crucible. Tell me, bring us more into that decision and what is it? What has it led to? I'm sure it made Unilever employees quite proud.
Well, first of all, I'm happy that that happened to me after 9 years in the job, so that I was a little bit more trained and schooled. But I also saw that the benefit of investing in all these stakeholders was absolutely crucial because they came to our rescue. Obviously, there are pressures and there are tensions with stakeholders at some points in time, but here we saw a broad community coming to rescue, and a model that was built on value building through values, a model that was built on dealing with the billions of people instead of a few billionaires was indeed a fundamentally different business model. And just as you said, playing the financial game, slashing all the costs, which has been the model of that company, is a form of capitalism that we don't subscribe to. But I don't think it's a form of capitalism that works either. Unilever's share price is up 60% since then. Theirs is down 40%. Warren Buffett had the biggest write-down. They've had three CEOs. They had an investigation of misstating the books. You know, there are many things that come with it that we really have to question ourselves about. And that is what the awareness I want to create in people. What type of capitalism do we want? I'm not against capitalism. I think it's a great word, but we need to bend the curve, just like Franklin Roosevelt did with the New Deal and made it work for many millions of Americans. It's time to bend that curve again. And there we should be more selective in which companies we want to reward and which companies we don't want to have around. I've never seen, and I'm not picking on them, but I've never seen them work on deforestation. They're on the lowest rankings in human rights indexes, etc. I personally believe that, and it sounds a little bit harsh, but I personally believe that we need to, as citizens of this world, need to take a little bit more action. With the shares we can vote, with the money we can spend behind products, with the politicians we can vote on, in our own behaviors, in the circles that we have, we can all influence that and not be on the sideline watching these boxing matches.
So Paul, it's just really meaningful to be in common cause with you, with the Howe Institute, and so many other ways in which our lives have intersected and overlapped. And thank you for being you and for all that you've done and continue to do for making it sustainable and better. Thank you.
Likewise. And thanks for being such a great part of our journey, actually. You've been, to some extent, a friend, a mentor, a teacher already along the journey. If I go back to the many memos that we've sent back and forth and found common ground and learned the same language and shared the valuable lessons in each other's lives, it hopefully makes us all the better for it. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, that's heartening of you to say, and I share in the gratitude. I've learned just as much or probably more. So thank you for being you and for the friendship.
Be safe and see you soon.